Hey everybody, I'm Nick Layton.
And I'm Leah Bottima.
And we're the hosts of Were You Raised by Wolves?
Each week we try to make the world a kinder, nicer place.
Well, that's the idea, at least.
I mean, we try.
Have you ever wondered what to do if you're ghosted?
Or what to do when a friend asks you to borrow money?
Or the proper way to eat Cheetos?
You know, the big questions.
So please find Were You Raised by Wolves wherever you listen.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network. Since 2009, HRN podcasts have been exploring the wide world of food, beverage, and agriculture. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org.
This is Gastronomica, an HRN podcast. I'm your host for today, Jackie Rowell. This series is produced in collaboration with Gastronomica, the Journal for Food Studies. This week, we offer a peek into Gastronomica's next issue, Summer 2024, out soon. Professor Branwen Polyket joins us to talk about food futures and food system change. Her co-authored article, titled Co-Producing Planetary Eating Futures from Dakar, Dietary Diffusionism and the Geopolitics of Nutrition Transition, written with Jacques Assau, Fatun Dao, and Paul Young, is forthcoming in Gastronomica. Branwen, thank you for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
To begin, may I ask you to briefly first introduce yourself and what you work on broadly as a medical anthropologist?
Sure. My name is Branwen Polyket. I'm an assistant professor in anthropology at the University of Amsterdam. My work is situated between medical anthropology, political ecology, and food studies, and I study everyday eating in the Senegalese capital of Dakar. And since 2017, I've been conducting long-term ethnographic fieldwork in households in the suburb of Pekin in Dakar. And with my collaborator Aminata Diallo, we've studied how people respond to external pressures or shocks, which changes how people provision their households. So in particular, we've looked at how people change their eating patterns and how people change their provisioning strategies in relation to the emergence of chronic and non-communicable diseases in the city. And more recently, we've looked at how people are responding to the very sharp rise in food price from 2020 to 2022.
And this piece in particular, your co-authors weren't able to join us today, but perhaps you can briefly introduce your research team to our listeners and share how you came to work on this project together.
Yeah, this project started quite a long time ago now when I was a postdoc at Exeter University in the UK. And it came out of some conversations that I was having with my colleagues there, including Steve Hinchcliffe and Aisha Mukherjee. And it was really in response to the Eat Lancet Planetary Health Diet. So this is really the pieces in dialogue with the norms and the aims of the Planetary Health Diet. And we were thinking about the Planetary Health Diet, which is, in a sense, it's a set of universal eating prescriptions for how we can eat as a planetary collective within planetary boundaries. So exploring this idea that healthy and sustainable diets are possible, or that values of health and sustainability are at least ideally mutually supportive. We got some funding at the time to run a workshop in Dakar, and so the workshop was organized with my collaborators at the NGO Enda Santé and with Senegalese academics at Université Gaston Berger.
Great. And I have a lot of questions about the workshop. I'm really interested in it as a form of collaborative, community-engaged co-production. And I know many of our listeners will be interested to learn more about this co-creation process and its potential applications. But before we get to the workshop itself, I just want to ask a few more questions about the motivation for it. So you mentioned the Eat Lancet Commission's 2019 response to transforming the global food system. It proposed a solution called the Planetary Diet. What specifically did the Eat Lancet Planetary Diet prescribe? And in your view, why was the solution problematic?
So the Eat Lancet Planetary Diet is a plant-forward diet with so it suggests that people can eat some animal proteins, And as an intervention, it makes the argument that eating healthy and diverse diets can at least potentially save the planet. In a sense, I think while I was working with colleagues in Exeter and we were deconstructing the objectives and the approach of the planetary health diet, at the same time I was conducting research in Dakar, and I was working with people who were themselves trying to deconstruct and trying to understand and respond to dietary advice. So they were thinking about all of this information they were getting about how to eat in healthy ways or how to eat a healthy diet. But this information wasn't always adapted, or it wasn't always relevant to the environment that they were living in. So in this sense, as so often I guess we can all think about how we respond when we encounter healthy eating advice, but a lot of it failed. So people were being told, for example, to do things like eat leafy green vegetables and eat broccoli, which are not vegetables that are grown in or are available in Senegal, or at least if they are available, they're extremely expensive, so they're far beyond the reach of the vast majority of people. So I was very cynical and I was very skeptical at the time about the genre of dietary advice. And the planetary health diet is, of course, packaged as dietary advice. So in a sense, they took an enormous amount of research and condensed it into a piece of universal advice, a piece of a set of prescriptions for how people can efficiently and sustainably or potentially sustainably expend their allotted 2,500 calories a day. So in a sense, the idea that there is a planetary carbon budget for food, which is potentially a radical or potentially a sort of exciting one, gets translated into this classic package for communication and intervention, which is the dietary advice. And as dietary advice so often does, it failed in a sense, I think, to connect with people's priorities, to connect with people's everyday experiences of navigating what they should eat.
And you describe in your article the planetary diet as a space of struggle over the equitable allocation of future resources. Is it an issue of adaptation, or it sounds like what you're working towards through the workshop and one of the interventions that you create with your collaborators in Dakar is kind of a rethinking of the process itself.
A rethinking of the process of communicating about advice, dietary advice.
Communicating, but also perhaps, I guess my question is it a communication? Is the focus on communication, or is the focus on what should be communicated, the substance of the communication?
This is a really interesting idea. I mean, I think that in a sense, my collaborators, and both in the UK and in Senegal, we are quite sympathetic towards the Lancet planetary diet. So it is a really good question. Is it a communicative failure, or is it a substantive failure? That's that's quite an open question in the article, I think. I think what we would really say is that rather than, we would try to deconstruct the packaging of food system transformations in this genre of dietary advice, and we would try to think with people, which is what my interlocutors in Senegal often said to me, and a set of questions that emerged in the workshop. If we are to be given this advice, if we must live up to this instruction or this invitation or this injunction, however communicatively it is expressed and however it is received and deconstructed by the people who are the subjects of the advice or the targets of the advice, how can we be supported to make the changes that we are being asked to make? So if that would mean, how can we get to food system transitions which are just because hopefully they are based in consensual negotiation, or they're open to processes of participation and deliberation and friction. And if people do have to change, and I think that we all accept in some way that if changes are deemed to be desirable and we do want to make the changes, how can we get to the point where that change is sustainable, is durable, with the sort of political and the institutional support that people need to make those changes?
And so the workshop was one response, and it served as a forum for the co-production of knowledge and practice, weaving between lived experience, history, and scholarly research. So why Dakar?
So what we were really interested in using the planetary health diet as a foil for this process was this very complicated word that is in the title of the Planetary Health Diet, and that is Planetary. And the Planetary Health Diet refers to living and eating and operating within planetary boundaries. So it means the health of respecting and attending to the health of the planet. But it also means a more than national community. It also refers to, or it evokes, a collective, which is all of us, a species collective in some way, and asks questions or opens up questions about how we relate to one another as a planetary collective. And so we were interested in asking the question, what does this mean from Dakar, a place with significant food challenges, a place where people are dealing with significant food insecurity in rural contexts and in the city, and how are people interpreting and domesticating and taking on messages about sustainable eating in that context? What would it evoke for people? In a sense, we really had a very open mind about this. What would it evoke for people to think with this idea of the planetary? What would come up for them? What would be the sorts of forms of reasoning? What would be the imaginaries that emerged in conversation? And how would that be different from the reception of the Planetary Health Diet in Europe, for example, which was, for example, you could say that it was very controversial, that people were very irritated about being told that they should eat less meat. So we wanted to operate within a sort of open-minded way to find out how people were conjugating these objects of health and sustainability and how they might speculate with them in Dakar.
Can you tell us about the workshop in terms of when it happened, where it happened, who it engaged? How did it unfold?
Yes, so the workshop happened just before COVID in Dakar in February 2020. And we brought together a number of academic experts. So these were people working in Senegalese universities or in NGO spaces.
In which fields?
In history, agronomy, nutrition, anthropology, and public health communication. And we asked those experts, or we asked those people with a particular kind of scientific expertise or a particular investment in these questions, to present their work in Wolof, which is the most commonly spoken language in Senegal, and to address an audience who were themselves highly expert, but who were members of a community in a peri-urban area in Senegal. They were all women. They were expert in that sense because they were older women who were responsible for cooking in their own households. They were responsible for passing on recipes and for organizing cooking and provisioning in their homes. They were also food sovereignty activists, and they've been involved in Endosante's food sovereignty programs in their community. So they were themselves an extremely expert audience, but the two forms of expertise were sometimes clashed, or there were points of connection and points of intersection. But we asked the academics really to not to transmit in a static way, but to work with the audience or to work with the other members of the workshop, and to in that way generate and co-produce new forms of knowledge.
And what was your role in the workshop?
My role was largely listening, but I thought that because I would, as I had asked people to do this difficult task of presenting their work, I should also do that. So my role was also to present the concept of planetarity, present the concept of the planetary health diet, and to talk about the emergence and explain a little bit about how the idea had been controversial or the reception of the idea in Europe, and to elicit and generate discussion about this very abstract idea of planetary eating norms, but it became in the process of discussing it quite concrete. But I should also say that public engagement is often really about, you would consider engaged research or co-production research to be maybe like the strongest points or the strongest moments are about the moments where people really respond. And there was also, when I was explaining some of the dynamics of the planetary diet and the concept of planetarity, there was, of course, a lot of, well, not of course, but there was a certain amount of disengagement or a certain amount of disinterest, which I think is, in terms of reflecting on the research or reflecting on the article which produces or writes about or reflects on the findings, I think thinking about moments of disengagement is as important as thinking about the times when people were very passionately engaged.
Absolutely. Just to highlight from your article and from our conversation here that the workshop tackled questions of eating futures, of food system change, sustainability, and adaptation by engaging a number of different topics. What it means to eat well under the conditions of globalization, histories and cultures of Senegalese foodways, sustainability, agroecology, and communication for change. You had mentioned the planetary diet and the Planetary diet.
Yes.
Can you say more about the distinction between the two, what they mean?
The Planetary diet is an adjustment or an extension that we propose in the paper, and that's drawing on Spivak's concept of planetarity. So rather than, I guess, part of our critique of the planetary diet is that the planetary, the use of the term planetary is seeing the planet as a kind of undivided natural space that has a certain finite number of resources that should be divided in an equitable way. And the way that Spivak uses the term planetarity is thinking instead about the planet as being a space which is produced out of colonial histories, a differentiated political space rather than this idealized or undivided natural space. So part of what we propose in the conclusion of the paper is that we shift from thinking about planetary forms of eating and towards thinking about what would a planetarity diet look like. That is, what would future eating patterns look like that were cognizant of and that recognized very complex colonial histories of domination, for example.
In your piece, you talk about the social value of commensality and hospitality in sharing food. And this was a key theme that emerged in the workshop discussions. How does ecological commensality and reciprocity play a role in imagining a planetary community or collective?
Thank you. Yes, this was one of the really important themes that emerged out of discussion in the workshop. And part of it was that people in the workshop didn't have any difficulty in imagining themselves as part of a planetary eating collective. And you could compare this in a way to people, to consumers in Europe who had an affronted or a hostile response to the planetary diet. You might say that they did experience difficulty or they did experience trouble imagining themselves as forming part of this transnational planetary collective. The community members who were part of the workshop came from a zone, a peri-urban zone outside of Dakar, and that was a place that had been had a long history of market gardening, so a long history of producing food for the city, of producing food for Dakar. And in the more recent history of that place, where the community participants came from, a lot of land has been bought up, and a lot of food produced in that zone now is exported to Europe. So in that sense, people drew on a very particular experience of having a relation, of understanding a relation that they had because the food that was grown in their environment, because the food that was grown around them traveled to distant places and was eaten by people living in Europe. And people drew on, yes, as you say, the very important values of commensality. They drew on a sense that people who eat together are connected to one another intrinsically, to interpret, and they use that as a way to interpret their relations, or the relations that they had with distant eaters, with other people in other places who ate from their own ecology.
And what role did food play in the workshop itself? Did you cook together during the workshop? Did you have that opportunity?
That's a great question. We did not. That was a missed opportunity in a sense. I suppose that we wanted to give people some time off of cooking. So we provided food and we ate together. So we had that shared experience. During the workshop, there were a lot of moments where people really talked in very concrete terms about eating. And in particular, the medical doctors and the nutritionists said afterwards, I've really never been challenged in that way to explain. There was a moment where one of the nutritionists was talking very much about how a person should eat, and this is what one should eat for breakfast, and this is what one should eat for lunch. And one of the women from the peri-urban community interrupted him and said, "Oh, but I just have one question for you. Is that how you eat in your house?" And he said, "No, actually." And it was really quite a sort of a disruptive moment. And he said, "It's interesting because I never really am challenged to answer that question. People never. It's very easy for me to reel off these pieces of decontextualized advice." And it's not so often that people say, "Okay, but hang on a second, is that what you do? Is that how you eat in your own home?"
Right. And that's just, it strikes to the core of the co-production process. But recipes did come up as a theme. Can you talk about recipes and the role of recipes and their connection with sustainability? I mean, what is the connection there? What did you learn about different meanings of sustainability, about substitution and adaptation, experimentation?
People were very interested in recipes. Recipes, of course, in Senegal are the Planetary Health Diet also produced many recipes. So in a sense, the recipe as a genre occurs in the institutional and the other context, and it also is important in Senegal, but they're quite different. So recipes are a very flexible social form that are passed between people. They're very rarely written down, and they're subject to all different kinds of adjustment and adaptation. One of the things that people spoke about, which stayed with me or I thought was very interesting, is that people talked about taking the recipe form, or they talked about the flexibility and the adaptability of the recipe form. And when we were talking about how we could move forward or how we could instrumentalize or use recipes in different ways, people talked about investigating recipes cartographically. So not nutritionally in the sense of breaking them down into what is and is not a good recipe, or it's a lovely normative idea, a recipe for good eating. So not in that prescriptive sense that we think of, that we often use recipe in English, but to think of what are recipes cartographically, what are recipes made of materially, how does the discursive form of recipes connect to the foods or the ingredients or what has been available in environments and ecologies historically, and what is available now. So what can the recipe tell us about transformation, I suppose? So it seems to me like a very different, sort of a bottom-up way, or a different way of looking at the recipe, not as a prescription, but as a really open form for exploring social change.
And this is, you had mentioned the past and the present, but it's also central to imagining the future. I think one quote I really thought was quite important in your piece was when you say that workshop participants increased the promise of sustainability to represent the future possibility of food access that's more reliable, and eating arrangements that were more continuous and abundant than in the past.
Yeah, I mean, so this was a very important idea. This also came up in my own research in the fieldwork that I was doing in Dakar at the time. But I noticed that people, and it was echoed by participants in the workshop, but because we generally translated sustainability not using a Wolof word, but using a French word, durabilité, and people often responded to that idea, the idea of durability, of something that would endure, of something, of a particular social formation or a set of social relations that you can imagine continuing into the future. People found that, in the context of Dakar, people found that to be a really radical idea. And it's often, I guess, when we criticize sustainability, or we sort of write critically about mainstream sustainability policies, We often say that this is really a conservative idea, that the idea of taking the present and projecting it into the future is intrinsically unsustainable. But from the context of Dakar, and with people thinking about the kinds of challenges that they experience in their household every day, and reflecting on the challenges of accessing food that they'd experienced across their lifetime, the idea of being able to rely on a consistent set of supply of food and being able to craft responses, or in a way not being always responding to outside shocks, not dealing with fluctuations in price, not dealing with all of the ways that people in Senegal are very exposed to volatility in the global food system, but instead being able to eat in a consistent way. For people living with food insecurity, that represented exactly a dream, a promise, something that they hoped, a set of political arrangements that they very much hoped would come into being. So in that sense, the local meaning of sustainability, or the meanings that people suffused, this term, quite a banal term in a way, but the meanings that people attributed to it in Senegal were very was full of political promise, was full of desire.
On that note, do you have plans for continuing this work? Might there be a follow-up workshop in Dakar or elsewhere? And I guess put another way, how do you as an academic expert maintain a connection with the communities now that the workshop has concluded?
We are indeed. So I'm fortunate now to have a piece of funding from the Dutch government. And so I'm continuing to work with Ende Santé and with my co-authors on the paper Fatundao and Jagasal. And together we're now working on a project called Knowledge Ecologies for Food System Transformation. And this project really builds on the workshop in the sense that it uses co-production methodologies. It's based on relationships that were generated during the workshop and which we would like to sustain and to make endure, and on community engagement. And it's really trying to think through how we can bring more justice, bring more deliberative work, bring more friction and reflection to food systems transformation, and how we can really disrupt the process that in the paper we call dietary diffusionism, that is the imposition of norms generated in the global north by a small number of people on people in the majority world. So we want to try to find other ways of working that can generate transitions and transformations that are more, are fairer, are more just, are more reflective of the priorities and desires of people in places like Senegal.
And you've been working on engaged research for quite some time. I think beyond this project, I enjoyed reading up on your other articles in preparation for our conversation. What advice would you give to researchers who work on global food system change, who might be contemplating a similar kind of co-production exercise as a form of engaged applied research? And I realize this is a very big question, but off the top of your head, any key takeaways for other scholars?
I suppose I can answer in relation to process. I mean, in terms of process, it's really about collaboration. The kinds of trust that people placed in us in the course of the workshop is a testament to the relationships that Ende Santé, and in particular the Food Sovereignty Programme, Werwele, have generated with the people who they work with. So we were only really benefiting from those very long-standing relationships. So having those kinds of collaborations is incredibly important. Beyond the process, thinking about, I would really encourage people, and this also is a reflection that comes from the having been through the writing of the paper and the reviewing and the revising of the paper, is also to think about what is the kind of knowledge that you want to build, or what are the intentions that you have for the knowledge? What will the normative content of the knowledge be? What will the impact? What would you like the impact of the knowledge to be? So we really were interested in thinking from Dakar, but I suppose not thinking from Dakar in the sense of reversing the flow of not having people in Dakar generate dietary advice for people in the Netherlands, where I live now, for example, but having instead really deconstructing and reimagining this project. So, but I think that, thinking from the very beginning in a very deep way with everybody involved in the project about what are the intentions for how do you want the knowledge to be used is incredibly important.
And just it goes back to your response to an earlier question about your key role in the workshop itself, which was listening.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to share about this work before we wrap up? And I should note that listeners will be able to find the full article in our next issue of Gastronomica. Anything else you'd like to share? Any other interesting projects you have coming up that you'd like to highlight here for us?
Well, I would just say, apart from the knowledge ecologies in food systems transformation project, which is now beginning, with my long-term collaborator Aminata Diallo in Senegal, we are working on a project about millet eating in the city. So in this sense, we're continuing some of these questions that came out of the workshop, because we're working with millet as this iconic grain that embodies in so many ways these desires for sustainable eating futures. But of course, it is very difficult to make millet in many ways fulfill that process, because it's entangled in women's work, it's entangled in household social reproduction. So just to say that is a project, a continuation of this line of thought and inquiry and problematization about the politics of sustainability in Senegal.
I'm looking forward to reading up on that once you publish. Thank you, Branwen, for joining us today. Listeners will find the full piece in the next issue of Gastronomica, the Journal for Food Studies, issue 24.2, coming soon. For more details, visit gastronomica.org and subscribe to the Gastronomica podcast feed on your favorite platform to stay updated on our newest episodes this summer season.
This show is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.
Hey, it's Francis Lamb, host of The Splendid Table. Every week on our show, we talk about food and cooking and the meanings of food and cooking. We talk with the most interesting people in food about their techniques, their culture, and everything in between. Whether it's about how fried chicken took over the world or how Instagram changes the way people are actually eating. It's a food show where everyone is welcome. Come join us. You can listen to The Splendid Table wherever you get your podcasts.